on the topic of how to leverage security as a competitive advantage. Now, if I could just introduce our moderator who's going to be leading our next panel, I'd like to introduce Hui. Hui is the Chief Marketing Officer at Soul Cyber. She has over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and technology marketing. And she has worked at leading companies like Sophos, FireEye, Cylance, and more recently has found immense satisfaction in consulting for cybersecurity startups and not-for-profits. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Hui.
Fantastic. Thank you, Theo, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. Great. So I'm very excited to welcome our two panelists. The first is Paul Haji. Paul is the CEO and co-founder at Harangi Cybersecurity. He has over a decade of experience and expertise in anti-money laundering, insider threat, cybersecurity, government, and commercial banking. Paul leads a team of cybersecurity specialists who create software that solves challenging cybersecurity problems, bringing world-class cyber solutions to the Asian market. So welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Benedict Cheng. Benedict is the Group Chief Risk Officer at PCCW. In 26 years of his career, Benedict has worked in global investment banks such as UBS, Nomura, Deutsche Bank, and HSBC, where he held senior roles in market risk and operational risk, as well as acting as business COO. He successfully led several key change management initiatives covering different product and business life cycles in risk process re-engineering and digital risk transformation. Quite a mouthful. Welcome, Benedict.
Thank you.
So between the two of these very experienced individuals, we should be in very safe hands to talk about the topic of leveraging security as a competitive advantage. So with the number and types of cyber attacks on the rise and the growing fact numbers of companies have experienced some sort of breach, a company's vulnerability to cyber threats is now a top-of-mind issue for C-level execs, investors, and boards, which puts increased pressure on CISOs to ensure their security controls work as they should. So in this discussion, we want to explore how security leaders can bridge the gap between security risk and business risk, and how security should be seen as a business value driver rather than a cost center. So let's get started. So the first question, and I'll pose it to both of you, but maybe Paul first. As a security leader, can you walk us through some of the early challenges you faced when trying to bridge security with the rest of the business?
Sure. Yes. So I think at Harangi, it's kind of part of our business as a security company to be responsible for this stuff. So I'll talk about like previous experiences at other companies. But when I was at Grab, where I ran the security team there, essentially my strategy, and I think there's multiple different strategies around this, was to sort of speak to security as a sales and sort of go-to-market enabler, and talk about with the organization how it can help them get the metrics of the business done better, right? I think there's multiple ways to do that. Obviously, there's the reputational risks, which can reduce sort of client inflow in Grab's case, or reduce the amount of data people feel comfortable sharing with you. But also, kind of like when you're working with big partners, I think it's key. And Grab and obviously companies like B2C companies, have a lot of partnerships with large organizations like banks or other large organizations that have even harsher security requirements. And using that in sort of speeding up and enabling those partnerships, I think is key. And that's kind of the way I sort of describe it to the business side of things. I think internally, it's sometimes a little bit more difficult. You can use the same strategy, but you kind of have to like really understand the business and really understand that part of the organization's role and how it can help them. So really digging in understanding the business, I think, is key for any security executive. Which I see most security executives thinking about how they can help the business in when making their decisions. But the struggle I see is actually like usually a level below the execs, where like more of the deeper security practitioners have trouble sometimes understanding and connecting kind of the security issue with the business issue. And really, at the end of the day, security wouldn't exist without the business. So I think it's really important to make that tie in when explaining to the different parties that you're working with in terms of that. But the challenges there come of basically two questions I hear the most. It's like, why is this coming out of my budget? Because generally, if you have a sort of formalized sort of P&L structure, if I'm saying from group level that the Philippines needs this specific security requirement for all of its employees, it's going to cost X dollar per employee. The question is always going to come. And, like in Southeast Asia, we sometimes struggle with that too, because the costs in Singapore might make sense, but it may not necessarily make sense in another market because the P&L structure looks different. So really justifying what's important, why it's important, and what's a requirement and what's not. Also, I think that's a very sort of key thing in sort of overcoming those challenges and making sure ultimately the organization isn't put at risk because of those questions. The second part is this is security slowing me down. I think ultimately as a security practitioner, our job is not to slow anyone down. It's actually hopefully to speed things up and automate as much as we can. But there are times where I think the decisions we make as security leaders do cause some friction internally at the organization. And it's really important to understand the business impact of those decisions and be able to explain that back to the leaders of the different parts of the business that are going to either eat the budget or have the friction of the security decision that you're making. And if you can justify those, I think you'll have a much easier time. I'm not going to say it's going to get you out of all the hard conversations there, but it will make it run much smoother most of the time. And I think at this point, it's changed quite a bit from 5 years ago. People really across the org understand the impact that a security breach could have. So they're more serious about like understanding and accepting things. But it doesn't mean the questions don't come. And I think the better you answer the questions, the easier time you'll have in sort of getting your initiatives done as a security leader.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. You've covered quite a few different facets there, and absolutely, it's not a very simple thing in terms of trying to bridge that gap. So Benedict, from your perspective, can you talk through some of the early challenges that you faced in bridging this gap with the rest of the business? So either at PCCW or some of the other organizations you've worked for.
I think I agree with what Paul was saying actually. I think the challenge is really that you're working with limited resources, and then but the attack surface is so wide, so you kind of have to make a decision on whether you want to make sure that your budgets are being spent on the with the right resources. That means places where you think it's more important to your organization. And then you put more, you basically allocate more resources in those areas, and also there is always a debate between business units versus group, because group look at risk from a top-down approach, while business units they kind of only worry about their sort of risk pertaining to their businesses. So what the group wants to do may not be always aligned with or agreed by the business units. So that's potentially there's a gap. And so it's important to make sure that that gap is being managed. And there is a clear understanding as to what are the business priorities versus the group priorities, like how they want to actually grow the businesses and, which businesses are more important and more risky. You kind of look at it from the risk and reward perspective. So I think it's always about how you actually allocate limited resources.
So do you think there's room for improvement in helping business leaders understand the impact on cyber risk? So in terms of whether it's financial, operational, brand risk, do you think they still need more assistance, whether it's in terms of metrics or just understanding the overall impact?
I think the important sort of implication is really looking at what would be the cost of not having a sound cybersecurity risk governance framework. Potentially, for example, if the lack of security, leading to a data leakage event. So customer data is being leaked or loss of customer data. So potentially there's a cost of regulatory, from the regulators, from local authorities, and also there's, leading to other, manifesting to other outcomes. For example, losing, customer trust, losing, confidence in how, we run our businesses. And also at the same time, how, the whole market will look at us from an innovation point of view and also from a franchise value point of view. So, all these have to be understand, in terms of impact, not just on P&L, but also on, some of the impacts are more intangible, like, for example, reputation, right? Reputation is, if it's damaged, it will take a long time to actually
recover.
Recover. So, and plus all, and that also relates to your brand, your goodwill. So it all comes together. Yeah.
So how well do you think security teams are getting at mapping cybersecurity risk to business risks? You've got the tops-down expectations from the board, from senior leadership, and they obviously are looking at the business as a whole. But from a security perspective, how well do you think they're actually understanding if something happens from a breach perspective, how is it actually going to impact the business as a whole? Do you think there still needs to be improvement in terms of how they're educated and how they actually need to provide, proof or value in terms of the procedures and practices that they're doing, how that's actually going to help the business overall?
Okay. I think it's there needs to be, the way business and risk management or cybersecurity risks are being set up, risk management should always be aligned to the business, right? The same hierarchy. And the relationship be, the collaboration should be very close. You need to look at how the business needs to work out and requirements, their business plan, how they want to grow the business in the near time horizon. And then at the same time, the security team will need to actually align with that sort of business objective. So what kind of solution, what kind of security framework or infrastructure, we need to put in place in order to facilitate the growth of that certain business. For example, I think a good example is many companies are looking to adopt multi-cloud solutions, right? Multi-cloud strategies. Maybe 10 years before, when cloud first started, a lot of risk professionals would say, "Well, I don't want to have too many risk, using too many third-party cloud solutions, because that means my data gets all scattered around different vendors." But now, 10 years later, that's a strategy, because a lot of the applications, a lot of the tools that being developed, they're attached to different cloud solutions, right? So you can't just use one cloud solution, because you actually need to look at what's the application, what it does for you, and then you look at whatever being attached, the cloud solution. So we're looking at multi-cloud solution, adopting multi-cloud solutions, and that means the security is going to be more complex, right? There are more attacking surfaces. At the same time, you need to manage different vendors. They have different rules, they have different policies. So I think the key is to make sure that, being a security team, you have the foresight. You know exactly what the business wants to grow, and then you steer it towards the same direction and provide the right support.
So, Paul, you would see this day in, day out from a lot of your customers, especially with cloud adoption. So what are some of the key challenges that they're facing, and what do they come to you for in terms of just help, in terms of sort of building that stronger ability to kind of just, map their business risk with their security procedures to make sure that everything's a lot stronger?
Yeah. And Benedict, I think, kind of teed it up there for me, given that Harangi's platform is a multi-cloud security solution. But yeah, that is one of the problems that, we've spent, years of R&D trying to solve, because we view that as one of the key problems going forward for the industry. Because of what Benedict mentioned, I think, that is a big challenge in terms of understanding the security requirements for all these different clouds. And the other exciting thing, and also the sort of little scary thing about cloud, is that of course they're releasing new technology all the time, right? And your developers are moving fast in the cloud as well, right? So I think that kind of increases the challenge, and makes it you basically need a solution to kind of monitor your multi-cloud infrastructure to keep up, right? Because it is changing so fast, and developers do have a lot of control there in terms of making changes, and everyone understands security is an important part of this, but no one's perfect too, which is why the security solutions come into place. But yeah, I think the challenges are tied back to those two things. So one, like all the clouds are somewhat different. There's some things that are the same, but there are differences in those clouds, and all of them are iterating as well, right? So they're releasing new technologies. Like I'm on the AWS sort of distribution list, and they're releasing like 50 new technologies every 2 weeks. And developers will use some of them, right? And that's a challenge from a security perspective, because one, you have to understand what they're using, and probably without them telling you, to be honest, just because the time to that detection is long. And then two, you need to kind of be abreast of what is happening in the space. And it's a lot of knowledge, right? And again, because it's changing all the time, you really need to be prepared and have something to help you do that. But cloud is a great thing too. I think I mentioned some of the negative aspects of it, but the ability to move fast, deploy, and build products quickly, I think is an extremely large sort of motivator for the business. And security supporting the business is we have to figure out how to secure that as much as we can and as possible as we can. And I think like from the business aspect, it's just kind of helping them understand the risks, helping them being able to identify those risks, and then having the ability to sort of triage and kind of work with the end user to solve those problems, I think is a kind of a key part there.
Okay, awesome. So just in terms of, I guess, boards and their proficiency in terms of cyber awareness and, expecting more in terms of not just, our security is good from a CISO's perspective. I mean, what metrics are really mattering more when, we're talking about a board discussion? What are they looking for? And how do they know that the metrics that they're getting is actually connecting with overall business KPIs?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this and let Benedict go as well. I think there's quite a few important things. I mean, I think the scariest thing from a board perspective is a breach. So time to detection and testing that, I think is quite a key element of testing your security team and proving value. Obviously, you can't fully test everything, just because ultimately if you knew the way the attacker was going to attack, it'd be a lot easier to prevent it, but you don't. So using things like red teaming, doing sort of tabletop exercises within your team to kind of show where you're at, which may not be good if you're new coming into the organization, to where where you want to be, right? So maybe your time to detection is like 10 days, but you want it to be 24 hours or something. And I think working with your organization to kind of progress along that line and showing your progress along those objectives, I think is a key piece. So, in our experience, when there's a new CISO or a new security leader coming in, a lot of what they're doing is kind of setting the understanding of where the organization is at in terms of security. And time for detection, I think, is a key one, especially if you're in any regulated industry. But also compliance is another thing. So, if you're a fintech or if you're a bank, kind of understanding where you're at in terms of compliance. Hopefully you've passed, but how do you improve? And then I think another thing, if you're in B2B business and something we focus on heavily, is how fast can you get through the security procurement cycles for your vendors or for your potential customers, and showing how you can improve on that, right? So, basically, once I've engaged with a third party that is potentially going to be a customer for us, and they go through our security to understand whether we might be a risk in storing their data, how is that time getting better, right? So maybe that's preparation of documentation, Harangi SOC 2 certified, getting ISO or SOC 2 or whatever it is that kind of gives you that other level of hurdle. And then really just time to response there. And then there's a bunch of internal stuff too. But I think there, contrary to popular belief, there is a lot of metrics that security people can use to justify not only their existence, but their value. And I think a key thing for the board is how are we getting better? right? And I think that, I mean, that's really across the organization, but security is no different. And the way that you can kind of improve and set yourself up for success is by setting a sort of example of where you are and then where you want to be, and then making progress toward that in the amount of time that you've kind of stated within the budget that you're given, right? And also as a security practitioner, it's important to say, okay, well, it's going to take me $1 million to get here, but if you give me 500K, it's going to take that much longer. And then, being pretty accurate. I mean, of course, no one's perfect on those sort of estimations. And explaining the risk too. And there may be some things that you can't address because you don't have the funding, or the organization doesn't believe that the risk is worth the slowdown of the business or whatever the cost may be, and explaining the potential risk there and what could happen, and understanding that at the end of the day, like, that probably is a business decision, and just making sure they go into that decision with the right frame of mind, so that going forward, they understand the risks, and documenting those risks so that if something happens, you have the sort of information there to know that, we made a decision and like we were wrong. And this is what happened as a result.
Are you seeing this mainly in the larger end of town pool? Are you seeing this more also for like smaller businesses and startups where the requirements are also as high from the board?
Yeah, we definitely see it in the big companies. I think it's especially banks and sort of even some larger fintechs. We see it quite a bit. I think smaller companies too. Like, one of the things I like to say, and I say this on every webinar that I'm on, but like, culture is free. And like, to set a security culture within your organization, does probably take a top down, if not executive level, but board level. And just asking questions about it, understanding how it, should take part in the decision-making process is key to building that culture long-term. And that doesn't cost anything, right? Maybe time, you can argue that costs something, but in reality, if you're setting kind of that culture from the beginning or at an early stage in your business, it's really going to help you have a good sort of security culture over the lifetime, which I think is, if you have 1,000 people and you're trying to set a security culture, it's much harder than if it's already been built into the business going forward. So I do see and encourage a lot of our smaller customers, and well as anyone I talk to in the startup space, that like, culture is free. Start asking questions, understanding that building in, sort of security reviews, at least internally, you don't have to use an external party at the very beginning, is an important part of kind of setting the standard for your organization long-term. And it doesn't cost money, because I think money is always the easy excuse. That like, we didn't invest in this because we don't have the money for it. But there's multiple ways to invest in things, even if you don't have the money for them, right? It may not be a technology solution, but some of the process implementation that you can do is I'm not going to call it free, but it's close to free, and we'll show up on the P&L at least. So I think it's an important thing to think about when building a business.
Agree. That's very valuable advice. So Benedict, over to you then. What are your thoughts just in regards to, you've probably worked with many boards before, just in terms of what they see as, valuable metrics, especially when it comes to, mapping the gap between, cyber and business and costs?
Okay. What I try to do, I try not to use too many jargons. I try to communicate in layman terms as much as I can. And because sometimes if you talk too much about risk, all the, complex stuff, and they get intimidated, they get lost, in the conversation. So try to do it as layman as possible, and also not be overly gloomy about the whole risk profile. Don't just tell them problems. Also tell them there are good things that we've been doing, and in terms of metrics, I tend to use a lot of heat maps to show the trend. Like, for example, even for KRIs, right, key risk indicators, I think what you try to do is actually observe the trend over a certain period of time to see whether the risk is actually increasing or reducing, and also where, because obviously there's so many, risk, embedded in your whole business processes. So you kind of want to look at your top risk, your principal risk, risks that matter to your company, right? And you try to convey the message across, focusing on those principal risk. And also, it's important to also use what's happening in the market as case study, as lesson learned. basically understanding, like what your peers are doing, whether or not they've done, they've done better or they've done something wrong. And if they've done something wrong, then try to learn from it. And I think that the aspect of actually learning from, past incidents is actually very important. That, for example, if some other company had a data incident or some sort of hacking, ransomware, and then you kind of want to learn from that, how you actually beef up your own security posture, how to reduce your attacking services. And I think those are the messages I usually convey across to the board members.
Okay, excellent. I mean, there are definitely enough breaches of late where we can all learn from. So there's absolutely a lot of more best practices that we can put into practice. So from a budget perspective, when you're looking at negotiating budget, and obviously resources are limited, resources are even costing more when you look at sort of headcount or security specialists, what are the main obstacles you're finding in terms of, negotiating budget or just trying to put it forward a case in terms of, we need X amount more this year because, things are getting more difficult, breaches are getting, more prevalent. What are some of the things that you're trying to get through to in order to get more money?
Well, obviously with the COVID pandemic, we're seeing a lot of, obviously people are working remotely from home, and there's a cost to it, right? If you want to, make sure that you're operating at the same level of security while people are actually working not from the office, but, from home or remotely. So, what we try to do is when it comes to cybersecurity related technology, we don't usually go out and lock ourselves up to certain technology for a long time. So we only use certain technology for example, for 1 year or no more than 1 year, because we know that the market is changing all the time. There are new technologies coming up almost every day. So we're looking at, what's available in the market. And we obviously, there's a cost to it. We then need to do our own research. At the same time, we look at what's happening in the marketplace. So I guess the obstacle is to convince the budget, the allocation of resources to focus on, I think what I mentioned earlier, the areas that are important to us, they're riskier to us, and then make use of what's happening in the market in terms of new technologies, and then find a balance, right, and work out the risk and reward payoff. And I also think it's important that the cybersecurity budget should be managed independently, away from all the other budgets. Obviously, it's still under the same company budget, but it needs to be managed separately. And that's actually how we do it, because if you manage it, if you try to commingle your budget, your security budget with other budgets, then potentially, you get a lot of noises, and you're not focusing on what you should be focusing. And I think that's how I think it should be managed. Yeah.
Perfect sense. Paul, would you be in agreement with that as well, just in regards to budget and budget management?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I haven't seen many organizations do it independently, but I do think that's a good idea. I think it helps, a lot with some of the things I was kind of talking about in my previous experiences, where P&L owners would ask a lot of hard questions around why they need this level of security if they're not, they're not willing to spend it, right? Which I think is, constantly one of the hardest arguments for a CISO or any security leader. So if you can kind of remove that from the situation and kind of really, if the organization is focused on security, I do think it can make sense. And I mean, that's a great point, Benedict, and kudos to you guys for doing it that way. In other challenges, I think, communicating it effectively in my case has always been to go after how can we help the top line or help the bottom line? And, a lot of that ties into the reputational risk, as well as in some cases procurement, especially if you're B2B. I think in B2C, it helps with the partnership side of things. I also think on the budgetary items, from a CISO perspective, being able to explain it in a way that is beneficial to the organization outside of just protecting us, I think is key. Because that's kind of a given in our roles. I think Benedict's idea is a great one that a lot more organizations should adopt.
Brilliant. We only have a couple of minutes left. So final tips to help other organizations help bridge the gap between security and business risk. Paul, did you want to wrap up with one final tip?
Yeah, sure. I'll just keep it in 2 sentences. So security is a sales enabler, and you should definitely it's an important part of, any organization these days. And the other is security culture is free. If you're a smaller business, do invest in that early and often.
Love it. Thank you. And Benedict?
I think it's just to stay vigilant, about, on all the risks, the new risk, the emerging risk, and also at the same time, stay persistent and try to protect, as much as you can, your business.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Benedict. And thanks to the Right Hand Security team. Back to you, Theo.